the Sri Lankan variety of the campus novel or the university novel is a very, very strong, dominant platform. There are many writers whose work cut across the university, constituting of the university community, both academics, students, the kind of tensions, struggles, as well as university subculture being kind of factored in at different levels. Now, why does Sri Lanka have such a strong presence in that university campus category is a easily answered question. This is, I think, because until very recent, the university was the center of knowledge production and knowledge validation in Sri Lanka. And this is also very true to literary production of all kinds. The university was directly involved, if not dominantly influential, in the production of literature, its benchmarking or its validation, as well as its circulation. So I think this is more relevant to a particular generation, not so much relevant to what is happening today. Today, what we see is increasingly the university has withdrawn from this central role. But till about perhaps 15-20 years ago, the university was taken as the ultimate gatekeeper of the steering of literature, both the production and the reception. As a result, a lot of academics were involved in the production aspect of literature, if not playing Nestorian roles, kind of guiding roles to students as well as writers, and most of the time the students and the writers were more or less the same. So as this was the case, especially universities like Peradeniya has been heavily featured in literature. So I think today's interaction will be about the campus novel, the university novel, definitely the presence of the university in literature. I think my discussion will be anchored on the English literary production, the English campus novel, but I will be kind of crossing over to the Sinhala counterpart as well when strategically needed. Now, one thing I notice right at the outset is if you take this corpus of campus novels, university novels, you can very easily put them into two broad categories. There is one branch of writing which is very, very nostalgic of a past, which the writers, through their narrators, are trying to construct, white campus novels. And then there's a second category, which are deeply critical, black campus novels. So one particular category looks at the university as a kind of a utopian space with green grass and a lot of freedom, and people are having an idyllic picnic of 3 years sponsored by the government, by the state. Then there's a second category where there's a lot of disruption. The disruption can be because of circumstances, politics, the kind of frictions that come because of student groups, but also as a result of hierarchy that exists in the university, academic and administrative callousness. This is very much, I think, more prevalent in Sinhala writing of the university. I might come to names in a few minutes. The reason for this might it's something I haven't really thought through, but off the cuff, I feel that this is one reason could be that people who come through the university, well, you can consider them fairly intelligent people, and maybe this is the result when you have people of intelligence coming head on with various petty stumbling blocks that are put in their way, like let's say an egoistic, very stubborn academic or an administrator. Then on the other hand, if you look at the idyllic aspect of the university, this could be how you subscribe to a certain privilege or an entitlement. It doesn't matter whether you belong to a particular class or the other. The university space is still, in that sense, a space of entitlement. So it depends on how much you want to kind of pull it apart or deconstruct it, or go ahead with the kind of sentimental memories and readings that you associate with the university. So this is something I haven't thought through, but this is just a start for this interaction. Now, when I talk about the university novel or the campus novel in Sri Lankan writing, there are at least four names that comes to mind, among others. Now, these four names, because these are like four key texts in my own reading list when I kind of interact with the university, these are definitely not the only ones, but four books that mean something for four different reasons. So I'll just highlight them. To start off with, I'll be coming back to this as we go along. One is definitely, I think this is in anyone's reading list, Edrivira Sarachchandra's 1978 work of fiction informed by, this is the important footnote, informed by his being a lecturer, an academic at Thoradeniya, Curfew and the Full Moon. It is also, I think, simultaneously published in Sinhala. Actually, I think the word simultaneously is not quite accurate. The book was written in Sinhala and translated by Sarachchandra himself into English. The Sinhala version is Heta Echara Kaluwarana, in English, Curfew and the Full Moon. A similar commitment by AV Suraweera, who was an academic at Jayawardhanapura University. His book Tread Softly, originally in Sinhala titled Attabidai Payaburulen. Attabidai Payaburulen, in English, Tread Softly, published in 1990. Then, of course, Rajiva Wijesinha, a book called An English Education, published in, I think, 1996. I might be mistaken, but I remember it as 1996. Rajiva Wijesinha's An English Education, set in Thoradeniya. It's a kind of a novel that takes us through an evolving, an evolutionary Thoradeniya across a few decades. Shavindra Fernando's The Vague Poetess, once again set in Thoradeniya, 1999, Shavindra Fernando. So these are like four books that kind of, I mean, I would set in the forefront of any discussion of the campus novel for four different reasons. One of the reasons, I would say, is that Sarachchandra, Suraweera, Wijesinha and Fernando, they kind of contribute to a discussion that in essence breaks away from what I call the golden era syndrome, which many people have when they look at the university. And I think this is, at least in my experience, very strongly felt in people's response to Thoradeniya University, because Thoradeniya, in a way, it comes with this reputation of being picturesque, the location, and also the kind of vastness of the university that has given that sense of space. So it's like greenery spread across so many uncharted acres, and it's a university even in this time and age of state surveillance and that kind of thing, which doesn't have boundaries, physical boundaries. Peradeniya doesn't have an entrance or an exit. You have an infinite number of ways to get there. So we have a scholarship that kind of not a scholarship. I'm sorry. We have a written tradition that comes from those idyllic, romantic roots of Peradeniya, which constitutes even people looking back at the 1950s, 60s to the 1970s. There is something Byronic about the writing of a group of writers. I won't go into names, but I will be coming back to them in a minute. And also, I think Sarachchandra Suraweera, part of Wijesinha's book, as well as Fernando, it kind of crystallizes the far-reaching effects of nationalism, because the consciousness presented in some of these books is a consciousness that is sensitive to the nationalist aftermath, free education, that generation who came through vernacular or Swabhasha education, and the changes they brought into the university system as a whole, both as an activist force as well as an intellectual bastion, is captured in these novels. And they represent the arrival of the village in the university. By village, I mean here a class and a background who had been denied education through colonialism, the kind of social system that prevailed there, and where the floodgates were open with the emergence of the new nation of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, with upward mobility, opportunities for upward mobility through education was extended to the margins of the society, including the villagers. So people who had no way of, I'll term it differently, people who were restrained and kept down because of traditional society for so many generations, centuries, suddenly having this open gateway education to move forward, and them arriving in the university. So these complexities are very strongly captured in those 4 novels, which I use as illustrations, use as visual aids at this point, to indicate an approach to representing the university in Sri Lankan English writing. University changed in the 1960s, the composition of universities. And this is a change which kind of goes from decade to decade. And I would say, to map the changes in universities over the post-independence, through the emergence of indigenous or Swabhasha nationalism, the best place to look for is not literature, but political biographies written by so many different authors. Because when the youth uprise came in 1971, and then anti-Tamil rioting or anti-Tamil violence erupted at different points, then again the JVP, the second JVP rebellion in 1987-90, the university was centrally caught in that kind of rupture. Let us not forget at this point also the civil war. If you take Tamil nationalism, both the kind of radicalization of the Tamil nationalism movements in the plural. Universities played a big role, but then Jaffna University, especially being geographically away from some of these southern discursive spaces where these novels emerged, the Jaffna situation has not been really factored in. But there are many political biographies. If you actually go to them, it's a different kind of literature, but a better kaleidoscope, I would say, to understand those changes gradually happening in the university system. Now, one example, now this is a convenient example for me, that's why I'm citing this. This is one among so many. Is the book the Lionel Bopage story, a biography written on Lionel Bopage by Michael Colin Cook, published in 2011. This is also available in Sinhala. It was translated. Lionel Bopage, one time JVP frontman, 1971. He was in the JVP till 1983. He was general secretary when he left the movement. Now, Bopage's story, it overlaps with the changes happening in Peradeniya through the 1970s. Then there are other biographies, like there is a biography written on, it's actually a memory-driven biography to which so many of its subjects' contemporaries have contributed. It's on MS Nishmi, the student leader, JVP student leader at Peradeniya, tail end of 1980s. Then there's a biography which was published to commemorate Dayapatirana, the Colombo University Independent Students Union ISU leaders' 25th death anniversary, and also kind of autobiographical writing of Anoma Janadari, who has a trilogy of autobiographical writing that out of the trilogy, at least two of them, two sections, very intimately interacts with the Colombo University situation. So these are some of the political texts, biographies and autobiographies that kind of frames the university changing through the 70s, 80s to the 1987-90 impasse. Now let me come to the literature proper, and I will kind of re-enter this subject from what I earlier mentioned as the golden era syndrome. So there's a group of writers for whom Peradeniya is like a scene out of a romantic novel or something. It closely represents for them, and sometimes when they talk about Peradeniya, they use this term, paradise. So this is the kind of literature that people like Yasmin Gunaratna writes. And there is a crowd, I would say right now they are at the tail end of their careers, but there is a crowd from that long ago era where a particular segment of society, so I won't even say the upper middle class, this is slightly above upper middle class, was taken as the norm of the university map. So everyone was expected to kind of emulate them. They were kind of the gravitational center towards everyone who was expected to move through education. So they are like largely English speaking, coming from fairly well set, affluent families. People who kind of, I think in their head, they still feel it, that they actually own the university. So I think 1950s, 1960s, people who came from the social peripheries, they were expected to move in that direction. Whereas 70s, 80s, the numbers, the composition changing, the gravitational flow kind of became a bit more complicated. But this is essentially the crowd. I mean, we still meet them, people like myself, but I think this is best said in Sinhala, so I think I should say this in Sinhala. It's the kind of attitude where, you know, at a party you're hosting, you suddenly encounter your stable boy or something. I mean, සමහර වෙලාවට අර හිතනවා යාළ ඇත්තටම අර මේ යාළගේ ඔළුවේ යාළට අශ්ව කරත් එහෙම තාම අයිති අශ්වයෝ එහෙම ඉන්න යාළගේ ඔළුවේ. ඒතර අර අශ්වයාව මේට පිදුරු දෙන එක්කනා තමයි මං වගේ කට්ටිය. the alawa hambun hamara a reaction. So there are people like that. But interestingly, if you take the Sinhala literature, the same era, the same 1950s, the same 60s, which is romanticized, glorified by some of these writers, there are very piercing critiques coming from the Sinhala literary camp. Now, I am quoting one name here because this is a writer I really enjoyed reading. He's a bit of a controversial figure, I would say, in Sinhala writing. He's not everyone's cup of tea, and especially in progressive and alternative circles, this guy is not really given admission because he's seen as a rabid Sinhala nationalist with very strong, stubborn ideas. But I kind of appreciate some of his writing, which goes back to Peradeniya, that goes back to the university to kind of critically subvert that golden era syndrome. So this is Sena Thoradeniya, and there are two books at least of Thoradeniya that has left a mark in me as a reader. One is a novel called Atalos, Giri Dudulu. This is a huge novel of about 1,000 pages. Part of it, not part of it, I would say the whole novel in different ways go back to that Peradeniya of the past, narrated from later on by multiple narrators who at one point were colleagues, people who met at university and then went their own ways in life. And the second book is Bandara Meru also by Thoradeniya. Now, when you move on to some of the other writing that kind of comes close to the university, we have novels like Mahaveli Meadow, The Vague Poetess, Shavindra Fernando. Then books like Chitra Fernando's posthumously published novel, Cousins. Cousins, I thought, was a very interesting interplay, very sensitive to class, social background, and how it plays in the lives of university students. But interestingly, these are all novels that are quite exclusively set, or I won't say set, they are exclusively centered, they're anchored on a particular English-speaking bilingual upper middle class. Strategically, they bring in the other social groups on campus, but more or less the narration has a slant towards that one category. Then, of course, there is this novel, Giniralla Conspiracy. Nihal de Silva, he wrote it in 2006, a couple of years before his death. Giniralla Conspiracy. I think Giniralla Conspiracy, the atmosphere gives a very strong Jayawardhanapura vibe. And I think Nihal de Silva, it's a kind of an incredible novel in so many ways. I think he suddenly had a bout of paranoia, Nihal de Silva, with the JVP's election result in 2004, where the JVP won 41 seats. Nihal de Silva, I think, comes from a very conservative, very upper middle class, very upper middle bordering on upper class background. Seeing this Marxist party suddenly having a resurgence after its total defeat in 1990 at the end of the JVP insurrection, I think he kind of suddenly felt the shivers and wrote this Giniralla Conspiracy, a lot of violence in it. And of course, I need to include this. Vihanga Perera, myself, I wrote this novel about a decade ago, which was a total failure, I have to add, called Unplugged Quarter, which was set in a university, or very, very close. It was set at the border of a university, I would say. It was an utter failure. I think no one read this book, Unplugged Quarter. So likewise, there are different kind of interventions to the university space. Very few people who kind of go and seek an alternative entry point, at least in the English language. Now, before I kind of press the stop button, there are two or three very short points I want to make about this university novel. One is, in my opinion, the unraveling of the university is still an emerging trend. Now, there are a couple of novels which are very strongly critical of the university space, but for specific and selfish reasons. Now, one notable example is AV Suraweera, Tread Softly. Attabidai Payaburuleng, the original title. I would say Suraweera is writing as an insider, and possibly highly influenced by his experiences as a Javardhanapura academic and a member of that academic community. But I would say if you take people who have both an insider-outsider balance, people who have been in university, gone out of it, the kind of critical stance in reimagining or revising that university experience, it's still very much a trajectory on the rise. So on one side we have people like Suraweera, then on the other side we have people like Nihal de Silva. So the kind of campus experience Nihal de Silva focuses on in Giniralla, it's something that he has no idea about. Most probably he's using secondary or tertiary sources to kind of construct that university domain, which ends up sounding a bit, you don't feel that he actually has confidence or that he masters what he's describing. I would really look forward to campus literature that emerges with a very strong critique, but a critique that kind of breaks that predictable two-dimensional display that we see on paper, and very much looking forward to the kind of literature that is on the rise. In fact, I am personally encouraging. There are people who do their literature with me, around me, people of my circle. I am in the process for the last two and a half years, encouraging people to write their stories. Sometimes even promising to undertake the burden of publication myself